Thank you very much, everyone. For those who don't know, I was educated at King's School some 30 years ago, so it's lovely to be back at long last. I spent 26 years in the city, but last year had a change of career, and my debut novel was published, and it was called Blue Gold, and it's a thriller set in the near future during a world war for water. And it's an example of a Cli-fi novel. So in today's talk, I'm going to explain what a Cli-fi novel is, and I am also going to explain a little bit about the publishing route that I had to take. So what are Cli-fi novels? I'll put up some examples here. You might be a little bit surprised to realize that they started a long time ago. Clifi is short for climate fiction. So any novel, any story that has climate change as its setting or as a major part of the plot. The first example I could find was Jules Verne, 1889. He wrote about the Earth tilting on its axis and the North Pole warming up and becoming a valuable piece of real estate. So they've been around for a long time. I'd also highlight Susan Gaines' book in 2000, Carbon Dreams. That was the first Cli-fi novel that blamed humans for climate change. So in a literary sense, that's when the Anthropocene era started. And they've become more and more popular ever since, for obvious reasons, as climate change enters the headlines more and more frequently, and we come to realize what's really happening. So, what did I do before I wrote this book? I was an economist, first of all at the Bank of England and then at a hedge fund. I did macroeconomics, and one of the things I was studying very great detail some 10 years ago now was commodity markets, looking at the supply and demand of various commodities. And it was then that I realized this prospect that water could become a precious resource in the near future. So I investigated a little bit more. So why is it possible that we're going to run out of fresh water? Not literally, but it's going to become a precious resource. First of all, climate change is going to make the supply of fresh water get worse. Droughts are an obvious example of that, but floods don't counteract that. You can't kind of average out floods and droughts in the same way. That it's not an effective supply of water. Second thing is melting ice caps, sea levels rising. That means that any fresh spring sources near the coast get inundated with salt water. And so the supply is definitely going to deteriorate through climate change. On the demand side for fresh water, the main driver is demographics. There will be another 2 billion people on the planet over the next 20 to 30 years, and they will need water, of course. Unfortunately, a lot of those new people are going to be born to parts of the world that are already driest. So the Middle East and Africa and Asia, they're already suffering from water shortages, and that's where these new people are going to be. The second part of this is a kind of two-edged sword. Economic progress. There's a lot of people being lifted out of poverty in Asia through their economic growth, which is clearly a good thing. But a lot of people, when you are lifted out of poverty, the amount of water you consume goes up because you might become meat eaters instead of vegetarian, just touching on Hamish's talk. You might buy your first car, you might buy your first home, and your water usage goes up as you become richer. So using a very simple economics chart, the economics students will realize this is very basic. Everyone else might be a bit confused by this, but if you restrict the demand of a product and if you restrict the supply of a product and you increase the demand, the price is going to go up a lot. So why might that be a problem? In this country, our utility bills go up. We grumble, we're not very happy, but we get on with life. If you're in poverty already, you can't afford to buy water. The consequences can be much graver, even fatal. You no doubt will remember the Arab Spring of 2010, 2011. What you might not realize is one of the principal things that triggered off a lot of those riots and rebellions was that the price of wheat, flour, and bread was rocketing at the time. Families couldn't afford to feed themselves. And so that was very serious consequences. Of course, if they aren't able to afford to drink, we will get further problems. So, although this is a rather grim topic, it also, in a kind of macabre way, was very fascinating to me. And I had this idea that maybe there will be a world war for water in the future. I'm not the only one to think this, but I thought, wouldn't that be a great setting for a novel? And so I went away and started trying to turn that idea into a novel. I had the opening scene in my head, and I knew where the novel should and how it should end. And it stayed with me. And while I was doing my full-time economics job, I started plotting out this story, getting from the start to the end, and thinking about how the world would look in 20 years' time or so. So it really, stuck with me, and I thought, I've got to do something with this. I'm going to go away and actually write the thing. And all authors will tell you it's a lot of hard work. That, especially the first novel you write, especially when you're doing it in part-time, 90,000 words is the typical length of a novel. You just have to find half an hour here on the train on the way home, an hour in the evening. Don't bother watching some soap or the latest Netflix series. Just get your head down and start writing. And so that's what I did. And I produced, finally, a first draft. Unfortunately, it wasn't very good. Most authors will tell you that their first draft sucks. And so I thought, okay, I've done all this hard work, but I've got a rubbish first draft. How am I going to improve it? And I found out about the Faber Academy. Faber and Faber are a very famous publishing house based in Bloomsbury Square, and they do a 6-month writing course. And so I signed up and went along, learnt lots of new skills and techniques that were going to help me. And it did prove to me that my first draft did suck. So I needed a lot of work. So I went away and edited it. I sent it off to a professional editor to get some proper, serious feedback. And I kept editing, redrafting. And I think it was on about draft 9 that I was happy with it. So this was probably from that first moment of, I've got an idea for a story, to about 7 years later when I was happy with it. 7 years is not unusual as a kind of timescale for writing your first novel. But finally, I was ready to kind of loose it onto the world. And so once you have got your final draft that you're happy with, how do you then get it published? These days, there are really 3 routes to publication. The first is traditional publishers. To get to a traditional publisher, you need a literary agent. You submit to the agents, typically the first 3 chapters of your book. You will have a covering letter and a synopsis of the entire story. And if you're very, very lucky, you will get accepted by the literary agent. They get thousands of submissions every year. It's a tough gig to get through these gatekeepers. But once you're taken on, then the literary agent will show your novel to a traditional publisher. There will be an acquisitions meeting if they like it, and hopefully you'll get a very nice, lucrative publishing contract. But they are quite conservative in the sorts of stories that they will accept, and it's a tough route. The second route is self-publishing. Very much easier to do. These days it's very cheap to produce an ebook, and you have complete control over the process, of course. The difficulty is that there are literally millions of people who do that every year, and so the chances of getting noticed are very slim. You can do some very creative things with social media, Facebook adverts. Maybe they'll need to think of a new route if Facebook disappears, but that's certainly another route to publication. And then there's a third route, which is almost a sort of halfway point between traditional publishing and self-publishing, and it's called independent publishing. There are small publishers that are setting up around the country. They're a bit more flexible in the sorts of stories they take on board. You don't have to have an agent to submit to them. They will take a few more risks with debut authors. And that's the route that I went down. Urbane is a lovely small publisher based in Kent, and they took my story on. They'll produce my sequel next year, next month, and then the third next year. And so I'm very happy with where I am. Hopefully, I've shown you that you can always, it's never too late to change careers. Hopefully I've also explained a little bit about an aspect of climate change that you may not have thought about. So thank you very much for listening.